An Iranian employee of the British Council detained for more than 3 years in Iran and sentenced to a decade in prison has been freed and returned to the United Kingdom. Her name is Aras Amiri. I-24 News correspondent Alec Pollard is with us. Good evening, Alec. What's the story? Why now?
Right, so this woman, she's been living in London, working there for the British Council on joint art projects and cooperation between Iran and Britain. And she went back to visit her grandmother in Iran back in 2018 and was arrested on espionage charges. She said that the Iranians asked her to spy for them in Britain, and she refused, and therefore she was put in prison. There was a bit of a public campaign on this to try to release her, as sometimes happens when you have these dual nationals who arrive in Iran, and she was eventually released via the Iranian courts, it must be said, where she appealed the case, and they eventually decided to release her. And there are also other dual nationals who are still stuck in Iran, whose cases are quite prominent because they have relatives also, for instance, in the UK. The Zaghari-Ratcliffe case, which is a woman who's been in jail now for 5 years in Iran and is still stuck there, and her husband has gone in front of the embassy in London raising signs and has made some media noise, and she is still stuck there. And it certainly shows the dangers that await potentially for people of Iranian descent living in countries like the US, like Britain, where they go to Iran, and in this case, what it seems, just to visit a old family relative before she potentially passes away, and they can be arrested and stuck there for God knows how long.
Yeah, 3 years. It's a long time in Iranian prison, you know, and she got released. Do we know if the Iranians got anything in return?
Right, so that is not clear. We have seen cases where, for instance, there was an Iranian Australian who had been released from Iran, and there were rumors that, or reports that they had released some Iranians who were in prison in Australia for one reason or another. So certainly it is a way, maybe behind the scenes, that the Iranians can make some gains, and we see various iterations of this in other places. Some would say that may be the case of the Israeli girl who was locked up in Moscow and then released, and afterwards Putin got some kickbacks when it came to getting Russian ownership over some land in the old city. In exchange for that, some people will say that was all premeditated at the beginning, that she didn't have any hash in her bag where she was arrested at the Moscow airport. So it's hard to tell, really. But in this case of Aras Amiri, it should be noted that most of the time she wasn't in jail. She just had a travel ban on her, meaning she couldn't leave, and that was the case with her. Certainly, it's nice to see that she is free now.
And there's another option, maybe this is part of the Iranians trying to play nice with the Western world vis-a-vis what's going on with the nuclear talks and so forth.
Well, certainly always public opinion and how things look is very high on the agenda when making these kind of decisions. Sometimes they will weigh that up, deciding what's better. Do we need to lock this person up? Can we get something in exchange? Is this making us look bad, and therefore we have to release the person? That's always something that is being weighed, sort of pros and cons of the situation, what to do in any given situation. And maybe you're right, maybe it's possible that it had nothing to do with the Supreme Iranian Court deciding to release her. Maybe it was the government who decided we don't need to hold this woman, it's making us look bad, it would be better if we let her go at this point.
Speaking of which, what's happening with the Vienna talks?
Right, so that's always on everybody's mind. It seems like they're not really going anywhere, according to some of the European diplomats who have been speaking out about that. We know, obviously, that Israel, always behind the scenes, is trying to press these countries to take a harsher stance. Today, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett speaking with Russian President Vladimir Putin, and they talked about what's going on with the Vienna talks, trying to pressure Russia to take a harsher stance. Probably not the venue through which something like that will happen, because in those talks, it's the Russians and the Chinese who are more in the Iranian camp, and then you have the European countries who are a bit less in the Iranian camp, and then you have as far as willing to cooperate, and then the Americans who are totally looking to slap sanctions on Iran unless they really make concessions. So I'm not sure there's much progress to be made there, but also from the European diplomats, they're reporting that this isn't really going anywhere at the moment, ever since this new government in Iran came in with Ebrahim Raisi not showing any willingness to compromise.
Right. Alec Pollard, thank you very much. Good evening.